Welcome back to A More Perfect Union, the Hill's 3-day virtual festival. Today's focus segment is on digital infrastructure. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Microsoft, for making this discussion possible. Investing in digital infrastructure is now considered as vital to traditional infrastructure investments like roads and bridges. But are we thinking about the whole picture when we talk about digital infrastructure? Connectivity is important, but are we investing in enough resources in digital skills training? Do we have equitable access to digital devices, which have been such a cornerstone in our increasingly virtual world? This segment will dig into these questions and more. But first, our usual reminder, please tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillAMPU. The Hill AMPU for a more perfect union. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, please refresh the page and that should be a quick fix. My first guest of the hour is Representative Peter Welch of Vermont. Congressman Welch is the co-chair of the Rural Broadband Caucus and has been working on issues related to expanding broadband access and closing the homework gap. Representative Welch, it's great to see you again. I mean, you and I talk about every issue under the sun. Today is broadband infrastructure. Let me just start with the news of the day. We just hear the president has decided to appoint acting commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel as chairwoman of the FCC and to bring on to the FCC and nominate Gigi Sohn. We know her from public knowledge. She's been a good friend of the Hill and we've talked to. Tell us what you think this does, to the degree that people matter when it comes to policy.
Well, it's a big boost. Jessica Rosenworcel is incredibly experienced. She worked in the Senate with Senator Rockefeller. She was on the FTC before, and she's there now. And now, as chair, is going to be able to continue her pioneering work on the homework gap. Early on, she saw the absolute essential nature of the internet and having access to broadband for the educational opportunity of our kids. So she's got a record, she's got a history, she's got a commitment, and she's got a lot of trust. There was a whole group of senators that sent a letter to President Biden, and many of us in the House did as well, urging the president to make this appointment. So we are really excited to have Jessica as our leader and great partner on getting internet throughout this country. She's going to be terrific.
Representative Welch, let me ask you this question. We've talked about some of these issues that have become kind of endemic ones that we've sort of looked like, connectivity. If people aren't connected, you really get a tale of two Americas. One where people have access, they're on the, on broadband, they're on the, internet superhighway, and those that are not. And we've been talking for a very long time about making sure we have equity built in to our internet infrastructure. Who are the villains in this story that have kept us from succeeding? What's in the way? What are the stumbling blocks? How can we make this issue one that we solve?
Really, when we started, you had broadband providers who basically had a business model where it made sense for them to concentrate in high population areas where the cost per unit was going to be a lot less and the profit per unit was going to be a lot higher. And they totally left rural America behind because the business model didn't fit. We can spend some time saying they're villains, but on the other hand, we could also spend some time pointing out the obvious. Unless it is affordable and it makes business sense, it's not going to happen. And this is where government has to play a role because, in fact, the business model doesn't work for the big carriers. And the great analogy here, of course, is electrification. In the 30s, the Roosevelt administration and Congress made a decision to deploy electricity to the last barn on the dirt road in Pownell, Vermont, in other places all across the country. That was not an economic decision. That was not about a business model. That was a social decision. It was a decision where we were not going to leave rural America or low-income Americans behind. And it wasn't just out of the goodness of the heart of the Roosevelt administration. It was an awareness that there is an immense amount that rural America can contribute, but it has to have the same access to the essential resources as the rest of America. So that, I think, is the place we're at now politically in Congress. There's a recognition that there has to be a significant federal role, particularly with respect to the resources, in order to be able to deploy the infrastructure required to get that last barn on that dirt road in Pownell, Vermont, hooked up to high-speed internet.
Do you think, Peter, that in the infrastructure bill that has passed the United States Senate, that's sitting in the House, for some outcome eventually, that if that were to pass and if the dollars were there, do you think that gets us, from 1 to 10, how far do you think that will get us in rural broadband connectivity?
Well, I think it gets us to 7, and let me tell you why. It's not just what we do at the federal government. It's what's done locally. This is why the example of rural electrification districts was so important from the Roosevelt administration. Our job here in the federal government is to use money. It's to come up with money so the funds are available so that communities can build out the broadband. But the actual hard work of getting that barn on that dirt road wired, that has to be done in the local community. So I'll give an example. In Vermont, we have these community utility districts. A group of towns will get together where the folks in that town have a common interest, getting everybody connected. And the geography of one district is different than the geography of another district. And the implementation challenges can vary. So when I say Congress is a 7, we've got to come up with the cash. But then the actual work of deployment and getting that wire to that home, to that business, that has to be done locally. And the community utility district model we have in Vermont is similar to rural electrification districts. So even if we come up with all the money in the federal government that would allow us to do the deployment, there's an immense amount of very hard work that communities can do, but they're going to be in a position to do it. And what I find promising is that you can trust people in your community to, when they have some money to do this broadband build out, that they are going to be committed to serving the people who live there, as opposed to some of these big carriers that basically have a bottom line concern about shareholder profit, corporate CEO pay, and so on.
No, I've heard that. We had a discussion actually just a little while ago today with a lot of leading thought leaders in this space that talked about the local game is where it's at, but also looking at churches, community centers, libraries as other parts of the backbone of
Right.
building out. And I think that's just an important lesson. But let me ask you. Where you think we need to do more, or what we have to think about, because it's not just connectivity; it's also digital nimbleness, digital,
Right.
experience, digital, skills and whatnot. And I'm just wondering, do you think there are gaps there, or is that something that will largely take care of itself when connectivity is accomplished?
I'm glad you asked that. It won't take care of it with connectivity because you can connect it. But if the person who lives in that home can't afford it, it's not going to help them. So that's why the two issues have to be getting hooked up, getting wired, but then there has to be affordability. And much like a telephone, everybody needs one, or has needed one. Now everyone needs internet. So one of the emergency benefits that we had in the Recovery Act was $50 that would go to lower income families to help them pay the bill. And if they can't pay the bill, then even though they have access to a wired home, it's not going to do them any good. And $100 to help them get a device. And if we're going to have the kids have access to the internet, which they need to do homework, to just be in modern society when they're getting out of high school, to be applying for jobs, then it's got to be affordable as well. So the two sides to this coin are the connectivity, and that's the broadband deployment funds, but also the affordability funds for both the monthly bill and also a device to get you started.
Let me just ask you finally, Peter, a political question, because you are Chief Deputy Whip of the Democratic Caucus, so you know where all those votes are one way or another. I had lunch last week with the very progressive members of the House. Last night I had dinner with Senator Manchin, in the more moderate wing. I'm just interested in how you think this is going to come out. If they come out with like a $1.5 trillion reconciliation package, will your caucus hold together to pass it, or because that is the pathway as it stands now to the infrastructure bill, to a lot of what we're talking about. So I'm just interested in any insights you have on the balancing act.
We're gonna stick together and we're gonna pass it. And a lot of us are gonna be disappointed because it doesn't have enough in. Like, for instance, I wanted very aggressive prescription drug price negotiation.
Right.
Some folks really wanted longer time on the child care tax credit. But the three elements of the legislation that when we started, even at 3.5 trillion, were significant carbon reductions, and there may be 1 billion tons of carbon that are reduced as a result of this, the first time in the history of our country that Congress has taken that action. 2, help for families, child care, pre-K, home care, the child tax credit, the tools that we need to help folks take care of their families and also get back into the labor force. And then access to expanded health care. There'll be maybe less of it than we had hoped, but the elements of what we need are going to be there. So I think we get there because there's unity. I mean, Senator Manchin, he wants his kids to get pre-K. In fact, West Virginia does really well on that. They are kind of ahead of many other states. So the price tag is one thing, but the policies and the principles are another. And there's unity across the caucus on the policies and the principles.
Well, Representative Peter Welch of Vermont, co-chair of the Rural Broadband Caucus, I always learn from you. Always grateful that you take our request to join us here at the Hill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Good luck.
And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Please welcome Virginia Lom Abrams, co-founder and senior vice president of government affairs and strategic advancement at Starry.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Vicki Robinson, general manager of the Airband Initiative at Microsoft. The Airband Initiative advances digital equity, access to affordable internet, affordable devices, and digital skills as a platform for empowerment and digital transformation across the world. At a company like Microsoft, we see firsthand that the technology of our time is creating new opportunities and challenges. From broadband and digital skills to access to devices, the U.S. must create 21st century digital infrastructure to make the most of technology's future. This will require broad, deliberate steps to support workers, reach students, and revitalize both rural and urban communities. While these are challenging problems, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to drive real change to solve these systemic problems, and in so doing, revitalize America's digital infrastructure in broadband connectivity and workforce development. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Virginia Lom Abrams, co-founder and senior vice president of Starry Incorporated. Starry is taking innovative key steps to help close the digital divide and increase access to ultra-low-cost broadband in communities across the country. We are honored to partner with Starry in locations where broadband infrastructure largely exists, but where the connection and devices to utilize it are unaffordable, leaving millions of people behind in the digital age. Virginia, welcome. Can you tell us a bit about Starry, including Starry Connect, and how it came to be?
Thank you, Vicki, for that kind introduction. We're really proud to partner with you and Microsoft to help accelerate the growth of our digital equity program, Starry Connect. Our company was founded on a very simple premise. Everyone deserves access to high-quality, affordable broadband. But here's the reality today in the U.S. Broadband access is expensive, 65% of consumers only have one choice of provider, and the customer experience leaves a lot to be desired. But what's even more troubling is that among lower-income Americans, more than half report not having a broadband connection in the home. We knew we could solve the first 3 problems with great technology and a laser focus on customer service. But we also knew that if we wanted to meaningfully help those caught in the digital gap, we needed to think differently. And that's why we created Starry Connect. Starry Connect is a specialized partnership program with public and affordable housing owners that provides access to an ultra-low-cost, true broadband plan without requiring credit checks, a lengthy application process, or individual eligibility requirements, all artificial barriers that were keeping families from getting the broadband access they need. By partnering with housing owners, we tie eligibility for our program to the premise, not the individual, so that no matter who lives in apartment 301, if that apartment is part of our Starry Connect program, the resident will always be offered the opportunity to sign up for our ultra-low-cost broadband program. We chose to focus on public and affordable housing in particular because we knew from our conversations with community leaders, affordable housing owners, and our partners at HUD that these families were the ones having to make the difficult decision between paying for groceries or paying for internet access. And Vicki, as you can imagine, groceries win every time. We launched Starry Connect in late 2018 and have grown it to cover more than 40,000 units of housing across our 5 markets. It's a program we're deeply proud of, but even more so over these last 18 months when the Connect program was often the only thing keeping families online and connected.
Wonderful. It's a truly amazing program. As you noted, public and affordable housing communities are often most disproportionately impacted by high costs and other barriers to broadband adoption. I would love for you to talk a little bit about our work together in the city of Los Angeles, Virginia, and what it means for those local residents.
We're so proud of our work in LA, and I love how we got there. In June 2020, Starry launched its first Connect community with the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles, or HACLA as it's known locally. We were in the height of the pandemic, and Starry made a commitment to provide 6 months of free Connect service to all HACLA residents who wanted it. We partnered with HACLA, the mayor's office, and the local community to get the word out, and it was a game changer for families who were struggling with job loss, COVID-related illness, and importantly, struggling to keep their kids learning online. You and I connected later that summer at the most perfect time. We were about to expand our partnership with HACLA, and you asked me, how can we help you move faster? Microsoft, through the Airband initiative, provided Starry with grant funding to connect what I'll call the last 10 feet of our deployment of our service into 4 HACLA communities: Nickerson Gardens, Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and Pueblo del Rio, 4 communities that were hardest hit by COVID. And as some folks listening may know, the most expensive portion of building a network is the last mile. And sometimes it's not just the last mile, but it's also the last 50 feet that's really costly, particularly in old and aging buildings that have no wiring or building infrastructure to support modern communications technology. Microsoft's grant funding was instrumental in helping us accelerate our build-outs in these communities and bring the necessary connectivity to families that otherwise could not afford the broadband they needed for work or school. As you can imagine, the positive impact was tremendous.
Thanks, Virginia. As you know, as we both know, millions of Americans don't have access to broadband, either because it's not available or they can't afford it. This has meant, particularly during the pandemic, that they were cut off from many essentials of everyday life. Public-private partnerships are one important tool in expanding digital infrastructure. Another great example, we went from LA and then we went to New York City. I'd love for you to talk about how our work with Starry in the city of New York to increase the footprint of broadband in those communities, particularly those that were especially hard hit by COVID-19, has led to real-world impact. Would you provide some details around what Starry is doing specifically to help close the digital gap for New York City Housing Authority residents?
Very similar to Los Angeles, our families that live in NYCHA housing struggle with the same issues and the same barriers to gaining broadband access. And this fall, similar to our partnership with HACLA, Starry and Microsoft launched our Connect program to 3 communities: Atlantic Terminal and Wyckoff Gardens in Brooklyn, and Eugenia de Maria Hostos in Manhattan. Again, Microsoft raised its hand in partnership with Starry to help enable acceleration of our build-outs in these communities. Both Los Angeles and New York City serve as perfect examples of how public-private partnerships should work. We have motivated executive leadership like LA Deputy Mayors Gene Holm and Brenda Shockley and New York City's Chief Technology Officer John Paul Farmer. These are folks that are strategists, cheerleaders, enablers, breaking down barriers and bureaucracies to help get broadband connectivity to where it's needed most. And when you connect that great energy to folks like us at Starry and Microsoft, then as you know, Vicki, really special stuff starts to happen. Last year, when we were deep in the COVID crisis, we had a town hall with our Los Angeles team, and it was a really scary time. There weren't vaccines available yet. There was still much we didn't know about COVID. But our deployment and installer teams were out there in our communities, connecting families to broadband. And I said to them, I know it's a scary time, but think about this. Every time you bring Starry Connect to a family, you're keeping a child learning. You're keeping them at grade level. And that can very well mean the difference between graduation or falling permanently behind. You're out there every day, not just installing broadband, but keeping people working and learning. And that is meaningful and powerful. And that's exactly what we're doing now in New York City as well through our Connect program. It's truly how we feel about our mission and our work. And I'm really proud that Microsoft continues to be a partner with us in doing this important work through Starry Connect.
We're glad to partner, Virginia. We all know that having access to affordable broadband services and devices are essential to tackling the digital divide. But people also need digital skills to take full advantage of broadband once it becomes available. This was one of the reasons we launched Microsoft's Global Skills Initiative last year to help people acquire the digital skills needed in today's economy. Our Airband partners like your team at Starry, Virginia, encounter these challenges on a daily basis. I would love to hear you speak to how Starry is tackling the skills and devices gap beyond building the network.
This is another area where I think bringing together motivated people is making a big impact. What I love about working with your team and Microsoft is that you're not afraid to try new things, test out programs, and continue iterating. And that's the approach we've taken with bringing devices and digital literacy partners to our Starry Connect communities. We work with a variety of device partners, but Microsoft has been unique not only in donating devices for our Connect families who need them, but helping us think creatively about broader device access programs and how to effectively couple them with digital education. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, and having a partner like Microsoft is really important as we really try to learn and develop solutions to really what has been an entrenched problem. I think we still have a long way to go, but we've made inroads in understanding what the barriers are and what resources our communities need to fully benefit from having digital access.
I agree. It's been quite the roller coaster, but in a good way. There are many challenges and opportunities ahead of us in addressing our nation's digital infrastructure. But one thing is clear. Federal, state, and local leaders, in collaboration with the private and nonprofit sectors, can help to close the digital opportunity gap with increased access to broadband-enabled computing devices, and digital skills. I'm truly excited about the work that Starry is doing to help these efforts. Virginia, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Steve, for convening this important conversation on our nation's digital infrastructure needs.
And Vicki, thank you. And first of all, just a big apology from me for the mix-up there. A big thank you to Vicki Robinson, General Manager of Microsoft's Airband Initiative, and Virginia Lom Abrams, Co-founder and Senior Vice President of Government Affairs and Strategic Advancement at Starry. Now we got that all right, so thank you, folks. It was a great, great discussion. Now it's time for our panel. Dr. Nicole Turner Lee is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, and she's author of the forthcoming book, Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Get on the internet, read her stuff. It's just great. She's made me, I'm not that smart on this stuff, but to whatever I know, I really owe it to Nicole. And Dr. Dominique Harrison is the Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. She leads a program which explores the impact of emerging technologies and develops policy solutions to improve the lives of Black communities. And Angela Seifer is Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which promotes broadband access, personal devices, and technology training. She covers it all and all these support programs. A big welcome to you all. Let me just start out, Nicole, and ask you, I think that many people, when they hear about the digital divide and digital infrastructure, we've been talking about this for a long time, eyes begin to glaze a little bit. So I want to have the non-eyes glazing scaffolding of this discussion. So as we think about the future, a more perfect union of what we can get traction. I know we're not at 0, but we're also not at 10. What can we really emphasize and get right as we think about an inclusive, a healthier digital connected economy and citizenry?
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve, for having me, and thank you for that plug for the book. I expect to be back. With that being the case, let me start the conversation out this way, that I think the future of American competitiveness actually rests upon all of us being connected. And we've had this digital divide for quite some time. Our friend Larry Irving was the first person to sort of put that language into our normative universe. And we started to think about the haves and the have-nots, who was connected, who had a device, who didn't have a device, who wasn't connected. What we've actually found in the last 20 years, and particularly after this pandemic, is that being connected really matters, right? And it matters because it's not just about the device. It's not just about the connectivity or the binary construct that we've created, but you cannot participate in the digital economy without actually having access to both a device and perhaps a credit card to be able to access a ride-sharing service or some other commercial vehicle. You cannot get access to your doctor without having a device and broadband to actually have medical visits. So I share all that for people who think about the digital divide. We're really butting up against what I think is something even more complicated and something that we have to solve as a country. How do we get people connected so they can, one, participate in terms of the use cases of healthcare and education and employment and the way that we actually have seen this country migrate from an inline to online economy? But two, how do we move people from the consumptive aspects of technology to the productive aspects where we can create jobs? We can create service learning opportunities, apprenticeships, but more importantly, and I know my friend Angela is here as well, how do we actually embed this into the local assets of community? How do we start investing in entrepreneurs that have the lived experiences of certain communities in which they represent? How do we ensure that we're supporting local equity and adoption? Steve, at the end of the day, and I'll stop here, this is a bigger question that should not be resigned to, let's just make sure a young kid has a device. This is a question as to whether or not that young kid who has a device also knows, and I had a daughter who was 14 years old sitting behind a computer for 18 months, that she's actually learned skills that are going to be part of the 21st century economy. How to work independently, remotely. How do we change that conversation so that we're not looking at the digital divide as something that's a nice to do, but it's a must to do?
Thank you. That's so powerful. Dominique Harrison, I've been taking a look at a report that you wrote about the Black rural South, and something really struck me when you said 40% of households in that area report they lack home internet access, which is much higher than the white population, significantly higher in that same area. And I'm just sitting here thinking, you know, they may not be wanting to watch this show, but they don't have any ability to watch what we're talking about right now. They're not connected to this discussion we're having. I just want to remind people of that. You know, we take for granted sometimes that we can have all sorts of access. We can, you know, watch Steve Clemons talk to folks he respects on Hill TV, and we can kind of do everything. But a lot of folks don't have that opportunity. And I'd just be interested in, is the lack of equity out there purposeful? Was it designed that way? Did we stumble into some form of systemically racist outcome here? And how do we, you know, whatever you say, how do we undo it?
Yeah, great question, Steve. You know, we want to say that I don't think it's purposeful, right? And I don't think it was necessarily designed that way. But the Black rural South for us is a unique population, right? It comprises the Black Belt, but it's specifically Black rural residents. And as you've read in our report, it's both an availability and affordability problem for broadband. But this reflects the kind of other structural systemic issues that are faced by African Americans in that community as it relates to job access, the lack of hospitals, and inadequate education for residents in those communities. So in order to address some of these problems, we really do need systemic policy changes that address racial disparities, digital inequality, and broadband connectivity. I mean, much of what we learned as we learned around the world in terms of lack of access to broadband is that the pandemic put a spotlight on digital equity. And our national conversation must be concerned with and really grapple with those who lack the option to subscribe to broadband or simply cannot afford it. And while our research shows that 38% of African American residents in the Black rural South lack home internet access, there are about 1 in 4 people who lack the option to subscribe. And so as we think about kind of the health challenges that we may face as the pandemic continues, but also the importance of children and workers being online to do school and work, we need to be focused on those populations that are totally unserved, meaning they have no broadband, or that they have speeds that don't even equate to broadband as defined by the FCC, and ensure that they have the resources and tools to be able to do the activities that all Americans should be able to do.
Well, thank you for that. Angela Seifer, you know, I think it's no news to the audience. We had a little chat before with, you know, a broad range of thought leaders and activists and agents in this conversation. I don't know if you heard my conversation with Congressman Peter Welch, but it came right to something you shared with me, which is, he said, you know, we get everything right in the infrastructure package. You know, we get to 7 out of 10 that really everything else is local. And I'd love for you to share that perspective on, you know, how we get the equation right so that we get to digital inclusivity that's real, and we can shelve this topic. We will have solved the problem.
I feel like I need to say we may never solve the problem, right?
Okay.
We're always going to have a new digital divide. The reason we're always going to have a new digital divide is because we're always going to create new technology, right? So like, but that's like, we want new technology. We want the next new thing, and that's awesome, and that's great for everybody, for the economy particularly. But then it's thinking systemically about how we always consider who's not part of that, and how do we wrap that in. And I think the comments already are really relevant to think about poverty, systemic racism, what has all led to all of the inequities that we have now. And digital is one piece that threads through so much of that. And so if we're going to address those inequities, we have to do it at the local level. We have to do it where there's trusted intermediaries. So community-based organizations, libraries, housing authorities, the folks that already have relationships with someone who's like, look, I've been scammed way too many times, so do not try that on me, right? So who is trusted by the populations that have experienced poverty where it's really worn them down, right? So how do we lift them up using technology as a tool to help them do whatever it is that they need to do? I think that trust factor is super important, and we can't dismiss it, right? We can't just be like, well, throw a bunch of internet out there, give everybody a couple hotspots or some computers and problem is solved, because that human element is really important. The human element of the digital literacy, the human element of convincing people that this is really a good idea and it's not a scam. Those are all people jobs. So that people part is a little costly. And so as we're talking about how much money, we got to wrap in that people cost.
Oh, I appreciate that. Let me ask you a question, both Nicole and Dominique. As I mentioned to the Congressman, Jessica Rosenworcel, whom I've interviewed many, many times here on our program, has now been announced as the president's nominee to chair the FCC, not acting, but real. And Gigi Sohn from Public Knowledge has also been nominated to serve on the board of the FCC. I'd be interested in, what you think, that means by way of, if people mean policy, what does that mean? And then secondly, a topic that came earlier is when we look at that infrastructure bill and you look at the amount of money in it, do we have any certainty that that money is going to chug through to the right places, as Angela just said that we needed to do? I'm just interested to know both about infrastructure and what these new talented folks in the FCC mean. Nicole.
So I think it's really great that we actually have a full team ahead, right? So we can actually go full steam ahead. I think I just tweeted out to congratulations to Jessica Rosenworcel, Gigi Sohn, as well as Alan Davidson, because now we have NTIA. Let's get to work. And what that means is we've got the people behind the bandwidth that I think is going to come our way. The challenge is going ahead is that if we can actually continue to stay on this creative path. We've gone through 18 months of a national experiment of what actually is associated with people not being connected. So my hope is that we find ourselves on that path forward. I think that's something that Chairwoman Rosenworcel has done by staying true to form with the homework gap, but also taking in the fact that this digital divide has just taken the oxygen out of the life of communities in addition to the pandemic. So my hope is that, as we go forward, honestly, that it doesn't become a partisan debate and we don't pull out old skeletons, but we move forward with actually some solutions, because now we have some proof of why people are not connecting. And we've got some success stories on what actually helped as a policy lever to move forward. With that being the case, I also think that when we look at this money, Steve, I think we got to make sure that it goes to what Angela's talking about, which are states and cities that are going to be responsible for moving the needle. We can definitely infuse cash into other programs or agencies, but most importantly, we got to get it to those who have worked out an assortment of Post-it notes that now need those framed. They need our support to get those kids back to school. They need our support to be able to move telehealth projects. They need our support to retrain local workers so that they're ready to take on these new broadband jobs. And so we would be, I would say, embarrassed and disturbed as a country if those that need it the most get the least out of this federal infrastructure bill. And so let's just get to work with that down payment and make sure the deposits are made where we can actually ensure universal access.
Thanks. Dominique, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm so happy that leadership at the FCC will really have a public interest, right? And really will be advocating for people and communities. So I'm happy to see that. And I'll say in terms of the infrastructure, I mean, the investment in the Jobs Act can provide a framework to make progress, but only if we put equity at the center of the legislation's implementation. Although there are some incentives for states to disperse the $42.5 billion in broadband deployment funds to low-income communities, it's important that states exercise their considerable leeway to target broadband expansion where it's needed most, like the Black rural South. And in addition to focusing on low-income communities and communities of color more generally, we urge states to prioritize projects developed by anchor institutions like HBCUs, like other panelists have said. And last, finally, funding alone is not enough. We need other critical reforms like addressing issues as it relates to digital redlining, and also ensuring that there are no rules to prohibit the practice of states being able to have their own kind of municipal broadband. So I'm hoping as there is this influx of money going into state and local leaders that they prioritize the needs of communities that need the most help.
Well, thank you. Angela, I've got a question here from Los Angeles that asks, what about elder workers? What about workers without college degrees? How are we going to make them part of this economy, this inclusive economy in the future? I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, so that's happening in some communities, but it's not happening in all communities. And it goes back to that local. Somebody local is like, look, we got to get folks connected. And so then they figure it out. And they're not just figuring it out in terms of making sure that there's an internet connection, but the right device. So for particular folks, a tablet works just perfect. But if you're going into a particular job industry, you're like, oh, better have a laptop, right? So figuring out what their needs are, and then that trust factor, who's leading them through getting connected to the internet, having that home connection that you can rely upon. It's not just your mobile phone, having that device and that tech support. Where's the tech support coming from? So in some communities, there's coalitions. We've seen there's more digital inclusion coalitions now than ever before. It's very exciting. And in those coalitions, that's where that work happens of, okay, you're covering digital literacy for this population. We're going to make sure we have devices over here. Where's the low-cost internet? Who's doing digital navigation to help folks sign up for these different services? So it's that coordination. We're not seeing that in all communities, but in places where we are, it is that the kids, the students, the seniors, the older adults, that everybody's needs are being met. We think of that as a strong digital inclusion ecosystem, a place where all of that is happening. But unfortunately, a lot of communities don't have those strong digital inclusion ecosystems. So the more that we can talk about it and get that out there, then folks can get to work in their local communities.
Well, look, Angela, I'm just slowly giving in to that idea that we're going to be talking about these divides forever. But I do hope, we mentioned our friend Larry Irving, who helped conceptualize the digital divide. Today he talked about digital poverty. I hope that we do begin to kind of rewire this around our social contract so that some of these chronic bad parts of connectivity get fixed, even though we may be having lots more events on the Hill, on these divides. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, and read her book. Dr. Dominique Harrison, Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and Angela Seifer, Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. What a great conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Kathy Mcmorris Rodgers represents Washington's 5th Congressional District. She's also the Republican leader of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. That is a powerful committee. And that committee earlier this year unveiled the Boosting Broadband Connectivity Agenda, help to close the digital divide. Congresswoman, it's great to be with you. And I just want to start out because I love your tweets. And this is just a hilarious tweet. And he says, I made the first 5G mid-band spectrum call ever in Airway Heights. That's near Spokane, folks. And I called my husband, and what happened?
I got voicemail, but bottom line, it worked, and it was super exciting. Brendan Carr, who's FCC commissioner, was in Eastern Washington. We had the opportunity to climb up on a tower, make the connection, and have 5G, and I was able to place the first 5G mid-band spectrum call for Eastern Washington. And certainly there's huge needs in Eastern Washington and all over the country. And it's always great to see the investment in this important infrastructure.
Well, I'm so excited. I mean, I'm very overt and open about the fact that I'm a communications nerd and a communications technology nerd. And I get very excited about 5G and kind of what's coming. So one of the big challenges, and we've seen it during the pandemic, as everything really has literally gone digital, is we have some parts of the country that are covered to this and some parts of the country don't. Airway Heights has 5G, and a lot of the other country, the rest of the country is waiting for it. But I guess in your Boosting Broadband Connectivity Agenda, which your caucus has helped launch, tell us what holes you're trying to fill. What are the problems you're solving?
Yes, well, this is a package of bills that the Energy and Commerce Republicans introduced. Each member took a different part of the Boosting Broadband Connectivity Agenda. This package of bills is focusing on permitting reforms, it's focusing on technologies. I believe that we need to be technology neutral as we focus on closing this digital divide once and for all. We also have permitting issues that need to be addressed. But I would also underscore that it's really important that we get the maps updated. In last Congress, I had led on the American Broadband Act, but it was included in the legislation that was signed into law by the president in March a year ago that will ask for more granular data on the maps that we use to award the money to close this digital divide. And unfortunately, we see where we still don't have these maps updated. And I just would continue to impress upon the FCC that we need to get the maps updated so that as Congress is getting ready to appropriate a lot of money that is going to the truly unserved and underserved areas.
Look, I think what you just shared is really, really important. A while back, I interviewed AT&T's new CEO, John Stankey, and he was saying what he was really advocating for was geo-mapping of in the United States of those parts of the nation and those communities that were not connected in the degree they should be. And he said, this is a knowable thing. We need to put it on a map. We need to know where to go to do this. And the government and policymakers need it. And I thought we'd gotten over that bump. But what I'm hearing from you is we have not. And I think as we think about this concept of a more perfect union and making sure that everybody is on the map, what's going on there?
Well, for many years, these maps were not accurate. And Congress took action last Congress, passed this legislation. It's my hope that we will really get these maps updated so that the resources are going to the people that need them most. I represent a region in Eastern Washington where Spokane is the largest city, but you don't even get outside of Spokane very far. And I have small towns where they have nothing. There's no connection. When Brendan Carr, the FCC commissioner, spent time in Eastern Washington with me, he was surprised actually as he was traveling around my district at different times when there was no connection. And COVID, this pandemic has only underscored the importance of having high-speed internet, whether it was our kids that were all of a sudden at home trying to do virtual school or the telehealth commitment that we made that Republicans and Democrats want to continue to invest in, or businesses that need to have that connection. We need to close this digital divide once and for all. But in order to do that, we have to have maps that actually reflect where the needs are. I'm very concerned that we are going to be spending billions of dollars, but it's not going to go to the truly unserved, underserved areas in my district and around the country.
I'm really happy you raised it because I think it's a very represented part of this discussion of the digital divide, and so I'm glad we're raising and getting beyond, the kind of stuff we always hear and doing. But another part of it about being a responsible, engaged citizen in our future is being connected, right? And I've spent a lot of time talking to people in this industry, and I know there are three key elements of connectivity. One is being connected, which your act is trying to address, and being open to who does it and who, and also raising the permitting question, which is another under-discussed element of this, but being connected, but also digital skills and also access to devices, which are other dimensions of this. And I'm just wondering, where is your caucus in thinking about how we do more than we have done in I don't know, upskilling the country, bringing those skills to a level that we don't have as big a gap as we do when it comes to digital literacy and also access to devices?
We believe that digital technologies, this infrastructure is the key to American leadership, for us really leading the next generation of emerging technologies, winning the future. It's foundational to American leadership, to American competitiveness. I would highlight legislation that my colleague, Congressman Tim Walberg out of Michigan, has introduced around the workforce. We're anticipating that in order to really to meet the needs for this digital infrastructure and deploying this technology, that we're going to need tens of thousands of people to go into this field. When Brendan Carr, the FCC commissioner, was in Eastern Washington, we got to meet some individuals who had been in other other sectors and talking to them as to why they decided to become technicians. And they're good paying jobs. They saw a lot of opportunities in this sector. And legislation like Tim Walberg and others, I think, is important to really raising the awareness as to the workforce needs and the opportunities for good paying jobs if individuals invest in getting these skills. And a lot of the companies, the technology companies, the broadband companies are committed to helping train and educate individuals so that they can meet these needs and get the skills necessary to make sure that we can actually build out the infrastructure.
Representative, there is this infrastructure bill that is allegedly, hovering out there, maybe one day to be dealt with, maybe not, but there's this big infrastructure bill and there's a lot in it. I'd just be interested in how much of that infrastructure bill, as you've read it and seen it, overlaps with what your caucus is calling for with the boosting broadband connectivity agenda. And where do you see the deficits in that bill, and deficits, if there are any, in the way you see the Biden administration's approach to this?
Well, what we're seeing in the House is that the Senate infrastructure bill has really been tied to the partisan reconciliation package. And we have concerns about the lack of real targeting of this investment. I believe that we absolutely need to close the digital divide, but it does include more money to investing in the infrastructure that's necessary to closing the digital divide. As I mentioned earlier, making sure that these maps are updated is foundational to targeting the investments so that the money, billions of dollars, is going to the truly underserved areas in my district and around the country. The legislation also needs to be more focused on being technology neutral. I am concerned that the way that the language is currently written, it may be possible for areas that already have connection, just want to have higher speeds, are going to take a disproportionate amount of the funds that are going to be appropriated. This is really a unique time in making sure that Congress is going to take action that's really going to close the digital divide, not just continue to focus on areas that have connection. We need to focus on the unserved, underserved. It needs to be technology neutral. And we also need to be addressing some of the permitting issues that are hampering the deployment in regions around this country. And so far, this package fails to do that.
Hey, I want our viewers to know that the House Energy and Commerce Committee is one of the most powerful committees in the House of Representatives, and Kathy Mcmorris Rodgers, representative from Washington, is the Republican leader of that. She deals with all sorts of issues across the board, which are part of sculpting the future of this country. So I want to really thank her for joining us, and I also want to say, Representative Mcmorris Rodgers, the next time you're in Airway Heights, I'm going to give your folks my phone number. I would love a call so I can actually hear what a 5G call sounds like. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It really is an exciting time.
And that brings us to the end of today's Focus segment. A big thank you to our sponsor, Microsoft, and to all of you watching at home. We're going to be back at 4 p.m. for Reveal, our last segment of the day, where we will be joined by White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, Senator Joe Manchin, and many, many more. This is a big one. You won't want to miss it. See you then.